This week on Filthy Hope.
How it felt in 1998 was that we flashed forward to Pilot as contemporary politician. What would happen if this happened now? The politician would not be going out to the balcony and listening to the crowds. There'd be online opinion surveys and the news reports and so on. And therefore that scene asked the uncomfortable question, what would happen now?
This podcast is a Uniting Heart and Soul production and was recorded on land that was stolen nearly 250 years ago. On this particular episode, we recorded on the land occupied by the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation. We pay our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and we acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. At Filthy Hope, we humbly contribute to the ancient and ongoing traditions of storytelling when we share stories on this podcast. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Filthy Hope, the podcast that takes place at the intersection between Jesus, life and culture. If it's your first time, welcome. My name is Jonty and I'm joined by a very special guest, Dave Cornford, aka my dad.
Jonty's dad. Here I am at last.
Yeah, we've talked about doing an episode together for a long time, probably since before Filthy Hope started. How are you?
Yeah, good. Trying to stay dry today, which... It's damp.
It's proven difficult. I nearly had to get the snorkel out going under the harbour tunnel today. But yeah, it was pretty wild and wet out there. So look after yourselves. Particularly, I know lots of people listen to podcasts while driving. Don't drive through big puddles like I did, but it was fine. So this is probably the first of, depending on the order that these come out, the first of a handful of episodes in the lead up to Easter, looking at the life of Jesus through film, but also talking to people about passion narratives and the pointy end of the life of Jesus. So for a bit of context, the reason why I immediately knew that this was going to be a conversation to have with you is you have quite a bit of experience talking about the passion narrative. Do you want to maybe just explain briefly, and then we'll go kind of through the timeline of what that looked like? Yeah.
I'm not sure that the number's exactly precise, but I have directed over 100 performances of a dramatic presentation of the Easter story in a couple of different contexts, and directed 5 different actors through the very challenging situation of attempting to portray Jesus in drama. There's been lots of parts and influences and different contexts to that. So yes, I think the number's 106 in brackets retired, close brackets.
Not in cricket terms.
No,
there's no asterisk
not out.
next to it.
That's correct.
One of my probably some of my earliest memories of being at church, the church that we both attend being transformed into almost like, how would you describe the way that the building transformed? Maybe that leads us into the concept behind that initial conception of the play.
Yeah, I think that we'll get on to talking to influences, but I think one of the key things was the story has a real sense of moving forward, of something happening and of things changing. And so the idea of the play moving as against being portrayed on a static stage is a really significant and important part. Now, straight away that means that you've got to be able to move an audience, which means, and in the context of what was called the Turramurra Passion, we couldn't really move more than or house and move more than 100 people per performance. So it's much easier to reach 600 people with one performance than 100 with six. But the sense of intimacy of actors interacting with audience and audience interacting with each other just lifts the thing to a piece of theatre that's different to what people expect when they go to see a musical or something like that. And so part of the challenge was then, 5 or 6 physical stagings that have to be set up and managed and changed as people move, and putting it on a shoestring, volunteers, basically no money spent, drives a minimalist approach. And that becomes a vibe, that becomes a really positive thing about the play, that the scenes are being and the sets are being manufactured, in fact, by the audience as they assemble in different ways, in different chair setups or whatever. And with each scene set up differently, that then creates this kind of sense of driving the story forward. Interesting things about managing the audience and getting them to move.
And it's not just like, to paint a picture, it's not just similar rooms set differently. It's actually like completely different spaces. Big open spaces, quite small, remember the quite claustrophobic tunnel, outdoors. Like it really is like different spaces.
Yeah. And I think we came to use the spaces that were available. And as, so this play was performed over 14 years. In the second half of that, it was pretty stable. But, we changed things. We added a whole first scene that wasn't in the original play. Because as we reflected, we go, well, here's all these things happening. And I think we understood who Jesus was in the original versions, but we didn't understand the other characters, the core group of disciples. And so to kind of identify with them, we wrote a whole new scene to go into the introduction of the play, which just completely changed it. It just completely drew you into the characters, because, the kind of thing was, well, do we care? And so the play in the end was topped and tailed by monologues by the 4 key disciples who are in the play, starting out with them talking about their aspirations and where they are, and finishing up all the way at the end of the story after Jesus has risen and gone to heaven, reflecting back and then filling in the audience on what happened next. And I think, that was one thing's just such a struggle with telling a story that some of the audience are super familiar with, and wanting to surprise them in a way that engages them perhaps in a way they haven't before. And then there's another bunch of the audience who've never seen it before. We have to assume that there are some. And so you've got this balance between too much explanation and them being completely bewildered about what's going on.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that was significant, that changed in the first few years as we kind of fine-tuned that approach of how we tell this story to those kind of two audiences and everyone in between.
It's interesting, like that idea of like finding the things that maybe are surprising, because people that call themselves Christians and attend church, this is a story that we hear about in church every year, often
more than once.
And so it always strikes me, lots of Christians have quite a, not strict, but quite a ritualistic approach to how Easter happens each year, whether it's as superficial as, or we do an Easter egg hunt every year, or it's actually, no, we go to church and we observe the same liturgies and rituals, and maybe we see the same people and we have the same, like, all different things. And so it can become quite, not monotonous, but the repetition can probably start to dull some of the edge that story carries.
Yeah.
So I imagine, like, in doing it that many times, there must have been so many conversations about, like, how do you maintain that edge and find the interesting things that are going to grab people that maybe have heard this story, like, possibly hundreds of times.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that story that people hold in common in their heads is an amalgam of the gospel accounts. And, you know, the Bible's great scripture, and it's not so good as a script. And when it comes down to it, you know, some guy is playing Judas, for example. Now, there are several mainstream theories about what was going on with Judas. Like, one of the accounts describes how Judas was possessed by the devil. In another account, he's much more of a zealot, a revolutionary who wants to overturn the Romans. And then there's another kind of framing of Judas, is that he was just plain greedy, that he held the money, that he had his fingers in the till, and when offered 30 pieces of silver, he'd just do anything for the money. Now, the trouble is, when you're putting on a drama for 80 minutes or whatever, and you're trying to direct a guy and write script for them to go from the start to the finish of Judas's journey, you can't just go, oh, well, he was either greedy or he was a zealot or he was possessed by the devil, and one of those things, and we'll just kind of move around in the middle of that. You've just got to pick one. You've just got to go, my choice was, that Judas is a zealot. He was impatient. He misunderstood Messiah as a concept. He wanted Jesus to lead a revolution against the Romans. And his honest belief was that by betraying Jesus, that would catalyse the revolution, which isn't how it turned out. Well, it wasn't Jesus' purpose. Now, you could argue about whether that's the right version of Judas, but you have to pick one, and you have to write dialogue and character development for that character to follow that arc. Otherwise, it's just bland. It's just nothing. And that applies to all the characters. It probably applies least to Jesus in the sense that we know him more, much more. Doesn't make it easy to portray him, but you're kind of not wondering, oh, what was Jesus on about here, as much as you are, or how does an actor approaching Peter, what do you tell them about how they're going to be Peter? And, you know, I think along the way, you know, there were portrayals of the story in film that you went, that's Peter. And the Peter part got completely rewritten after I saw The Miracle Maker, which was, I think, so that was 1999. So that might have been, I might have seen it a couple of years after the play started in 1999. And this portrayal of Peter as a hothead who blundered in, and you go back and go, is that in the scripture? Yes. It's not like it leaps out at you, but yeah, portraying Peter like that, that's his character trait. Does that drive him into the things that Peter does? Yes. Okay. Let's tell the actor who's playing Peter that that's his character, and all of a sudden they're free to be like that on stage and the character comes to life. Oh, that's Peter. That's how we're portraying Peter in this drama. Yeah. But then you have a story that has sizzle to it. And when I mean that, I mean a drama production that has sizzle.
There's narrative excitement to it.
Correct.
Yeah.
And without that, it's just very flat. And again, so there's a big burden there for the actor and the director and the writer to go, am I doing justice to the story? Is this close? And I don't mean close enough isn't right. Does this fill in the gaps well? So that's one of the real kind of tricky things that you can't just go, oh yeah, we'll just do an adaptation from Luke's gospel and we'll just write a drama.
Word for word.
Which is what we did in a sense structurally, that's what it is, but it doesn't do it for drama.
Yeah.
I guess that, that's at a basic level of characterisation. But then I also wanted to really push the boundaries a bit, and so the play isn't, the Turramurra Passion wasn't set in time in terms of towels on heads and period costumes and stuff, and then for the trial before pilot, we kind of flashed, how it felt in 1998 was that we flashed forward to pilot as contemporary politician. What would happen if this happened now? The politician would not be going out to the balcony and listening to the crowds. There'd be online opinion surveys and the news reports and so on. And therefore that scene asked the uncomfortable question, what would happen now? The answer being, well, of course, it could happen exactly the same way, that a crowd could be gathered, fake responses can be, or fake or real responses can be garnered and displayed in public to influence the way politicians behave and the actions that they take. And also that they are real people slammed between the competing interests of others and politics and their own survival. It's kind of interesting that, one thing I reflected on a lot was, 15 years after that was written, it didn't shock as much as it did the first time. At all. It didn't feel, in a way it was an outrageous thing to put into a passion play, but after 15 years it didn't feel like, to me, it didn't feel like that. It felt almost a predictable thing to write in the context of 2011-12 when we finished that up compared to 15 years before.
Yeah, because I just immediately think of like the tribalism and the culture around like the culture wars and Twitter and everything that is just commonplace today, and how like that scene would probably play out if it was written to take place today. It wouldn't be shocking or weird. It would just kind of be, that's probably exactly how that would play out. Yeah. And just there's completely off topic, but there's a film called Chef, which is a road movie essentially, and the publicity that's being garnered in the story, driven by the Twitter account that's being run by this chef's 11-year-old son, or he's younger than that, and they're portrayed as overlays on the visuals of the film, the tweets going out, and the chef knows nothing about it, shows up somewhere and there's a crowd ready to buy stuff from his food van. That's a more contemporary kind of portrayal of that kind of world. Yeah. Because I just, particularly with the artificial anger that's drummed up in the crowd, with Pilot out in the balcony, for example, like you could very easily translate that into our current culture.
Yeah.
It strikes me.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, one particular thing was in that scene is the conflict or the arm wrestle between the religious authorities and the political authorities in Caiaphas, the chief priest, and Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. They've got all these things to worry about, and they're trying to engineer an outcome. Yeah. As I said, we tried to imagine a politician's office for
I remember the whiteboards and
portraying that with a whiteboard and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder, like, how did, because I want to come back to, there's another film in particular that we're going to talk about as an influence and maybe what that has to say about the life of Jesus as well. But so you kind of already touched on this a little bit, but how did the Turramurra Passion, as it was at the time, how did that develop, and what was the trajectory that kind of followed up until 2012?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So winding back 3 or 4 years before it started, the loose drama team at church had done an original musical, as in written a musical, songs and everything, and performed it. And it was had a gospel theme to it, I guess. And I think in the aftermath of that, we were kind of thinking, man, what can we do that doesn't take as much work? What can we do that doesn't involving attempting to write 10 or 12 original songs, which is what the team did with someone who's now a very well-known musician in Sydney at the core as musical director. We didn't have access to that, though, some of those resources. And so sitting on kind of the influence from seeing the film we'll talk about, Jesus of Montreal, from 6 or 7 years earlier, I kind of was part of a conversation that said, well, why don't we do this at Easter? Why don't we do something special at Easter? Because, and what I mean by that is do something special before Easter, because at Easter, everyone is away on holidays with the kids, with their families and so on. And so this idea of writing a 6-act classic cycle play in the Passion play format. So starting out as script editor, I divided up the scenes, resourced the writers, and I already at that stage had the idea that we've just talked about for the pilot scene. I wrote that straight down in a couple of hours. It
strikes me as a very, like the TV show Utopia, similar kind of poking a little bit of like some satirical edge on the whole political.
Absolutely, and that had come to me straight away, and I as editor, I allocated that scene to myself and wrote it first.
Yeah.
And as the weeks and months passed, no one had written the other chunks, and so in the end, I put most of it together. And then the very first performance was in place of the evening service with 3 rehearsals or something on a Sunday night. It was a pretty immature version of what it became. And to facilitate the lack of rehearsal time, we used 2 storytellers. So there was plenty, too much in retrospect, storytelling by the storytellers.
Kind of like narration.
Almost, filling in the gaps, telling the story. By 4 or 5 years in, we'd made the storytellers redundant. We didn't have them anymore. We'd written in more characters. We had the momentum to that people knew that they were signing up for many more rehearsals than 2 or 3. And so it became much less, well, there was much less danger of it feeling like a storytelling session. So that was one of the things that changed. Extra scene. We used music to mark the transitions between the scenes. And in the original version, that were songs, instrumental music that I had picked from my collection. And then 2 or 3 years in, there was a youngish guy who was a musician who offered to write original music for the transitions between the scenes. And so the first year he performed that live at the piano in the centre and kind of filled the place with music, and then we recorded that and used his music as the instrumental fills that created moods as the audience then moved between scenes. And yeah, just as I said before, a whole scene got added, and the cast evolved over time, with 3 different actors playing Jesus for 5 years, 4 years and 5 years between the 3. I guess at the end, everyone who'd been involved, and a lot of people for a lot of the time, were no longer a bunch of school and uni students and young adults. And so not their enthusiasm, but their capacity was being constrained by life. And I wasn't getting a sense that there was a team building around the production. And so there's an awful lot of personal effort from me. And so after some health issues in 2012, I just didn't feel up to doing it again. But that also coincided with, you know, some prayer and reflection with the minister and, you know, other people, and just going, has it run its course? Is it? And those things kind of lined up for us to go, we're just we won't do it again.
Also, my memory of church at that time was that certainly that I was aware of, there was not a revolving door, but it felt like in terms of the people that were attending church, there was a bit of a change happening, and probably, lined up with the fact that a lot of the people that had started doing the Turramurra Passion were now no longer high school, young adult age. Because at that point I was 13 or 14. I remember there was a big, lots of the people that were either leaders at youth group or were that kind of age had started to move on, and my memory certainly is that kind of coincided, so that just another layer of it probably might have been a natural life cycle almost.
And that's how it felt. And I mean, even 2 weeks ago, someone said that they had recently had a conversation with someone from outside the church going, oh, are you going to do that Easter thing again? And that, you know, that makes me feel, well, mixed feelings. You know, the door's not closed to doing it again. But, you know, that was 25 years ago that I catalysed a then contemporary production. I think that's probably for someone else to do. Otherwise, they're cranking the handle on my stuff. And if that's what someone wants to do, I'm completely happy with it. And in fact, over time, there were a number of people who contacted us through the website and asked us for permission to use the script, which we checked out who they were just a little bit and happily did that. And that, I don't think that led to anything huge other than a few other places using the script to put on an Easter play a couple of times. And that was, that was good. One thing's just come to mind. Another one of the things that influenced the development of the script was a radio play that the BBC did in World War II called The Man Who Would Be King. Mm. And, I think someone said, you should look at this. I found a copy of the script on eBay and I have lost, in a hard drive crash, they weren't in the right place. I actually found from a library the 12 audio files of the episodes. So it was written by Dorothy Sayers. It was performed as a radio play, so scripted and different actors playing the parts, and was hugely controversial. It was controversial because a bunch of atheists didn't like that BBC was propagating Christian propaganda. A bunch of conservative Christians were really antsy about any portrayal of Jesus at all. And then there was controversy, remembering that in the 1940s, the King James Version of the Bible would have been pretty universal in the English-speaking world. Sayers chose to use contemporary language, and that was extremely controversial. Like, controversial was brought up in Parliament, right? And so this 1 hour radio play the episodes were put out monthly.
Over a whole year.
In 1941 and 1942, wow. Yeah. So a long time to wait for the next one.
Yeah.
And again, I think I just picked up heaps of little snippets from that, particularly about the use of language and character. Again, the character development to add just that little bit of extra depth and colour to the various characters, in the kind of third and fourth year when the script was really getting revised quite a bit. And so I was just reading about it this morning to refresh my memory. The BBC don't have recordings of it, but there are there are recordings somewhere. Who knows where I found it, downloaded it from some library in the States from memory. But the audio recordings do exist, and the script exists published in it's quite a thick book, 12 hours of drama. It's an astonishing piece of work, just amazing.
Was it just the updated language? Were there any other things about it that particularly were influential?
I think that, as we talked earlier about, to write great drama, you have to fill in the gaps. And it's a long time since I've read it and listened to it, so I can't cite specific examples, but that was part of the challenge, or the controversy that was created, because there was filling in the gaps in terms of characters and so on, and people didn't like that. I think it's, compared to how they had read scripture in the King James Version, it sounded very familiar.
Yeah.
Which, of course, as a storyteller, I would go, well, of course you would be familiar, because you want people to actually to listen, understand, and place themselves in the story to understand it. But then, as now and before, people who would have different views about how to understand the story and process it. Just an amazing piece of work.
I'll see if I can find whether it's at an online library or somewhere. If I can find it, I'll put a link to it.
Yeah, and like my memory was, downloading MP3s one by one. From somewhere. Whether it's still available, I just don't know. As I said, it would now be at least 20 years since I downloaded those files.
Yeah, wow.
Because, it would have been 2003, 2000, that kind of time.
Yeah. Which probably is a good time to hang a right to Jesus of Montreal,
Yeah.
which I watched for the first time this morning.
Yeah.
It's been a DVD that has always existed to me because it just has always been on a shelf.
Yep.
And I was probably too young to watch it for a long time. And then when I was old enough, it just didn't cross my radar. 1989 French-Canadian film called Jesus of Montreal. Was it something that you saw when it came out, or did you kind of come across it later, and then how did that kind of inform the Turramurra Passion stuff?
Yeah.
And then we'll dive into the movie itself as well.
Yeah, so one of my best mates had seen it. It was, I guess you'd call it an outhouse release, and had recommended it, and so I went and saw it
At the cinema?
at the cinema. It might even have been the first date that your mother and I went out on
there you
to
go.
see the film. And so that's 1990, I'd be
Yeah,
guessing.
I was looking at it this morning. July of 1990 is when it says it came out in Australia.
Yeah. And so that kind of sat there, like it was 8 or 9 years after that we first did the play. But I think that when we started to talk about that idea, the way what's in the film was just such an obvious influence. So the film is about a group of actors who put on a passion play. So there's kind of this dual narrative of the lead actor and director and his band of actors and their life together. And then there's the play that they're putting on, taking over a traditional
It's Catholic, isn't it?
portrayal in a Catholic convent or cathedral, or I think in Montreal. And so there's this conflict built into it about how they want to portray the story and how the masters, including a priest who has studied drama and travelled the world researching theatre, who really does, he kind of says, it's a bit stale, maybe you could tighten it up around the edges. And of course they just throw it in the bin and start from scratch. The form of the play that they put on is outdoors mostly. It moves from place to place, and two of the female characters act as narrators, filling in the gaps, and there's a very close interaction between the cast and the audience in this physical space. So you can see they're all things that we've talked about in terms that you can see in what we did in the Turramurra Passion. There are so many layers to the film. It's really interesting that the play that they put on, it's hard to know what the right word is. I guess it's a bit revisionist in its theology about, what the biblical record says about Jesus. But there's, in fact, more validation or drawing on the biblical story in the lives of the actors. There's as much there as there is in the play. There are heaps of them, but spoiler alert.
It's 40 years old.
It's a 40-year-old film.
30, whatever.
35. One of the key things is that we opened, the film kind of opens with a play, and it's the end and there's an ovation, and the media types, the theatre critics are fawning over the lead actor, wanting to get them on their chat show. One of them is an advertising executive and says, I want his head, I want his face. And then this actor says, I'm not the greatest actor, this guy is. So that's an allusion to obviously John the Baptist pointing to Jesus, and he's pointing to Daniel, the guy who then is the lead director and actor in the play. And then at the very end of the film, where things have happened, and the cast are kind of in this desperate situation in a railway station, the first actor's image, massive picture
Of his head.
Advertising a perfume, which is the parallel again to Herod delivering John the Baptist's head on a plate.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one of the things where you see these parallels. Another one is, as the play gains momentum, the hangers-on and the entrepreneurs are around, and the lead actor gets taken up to a skyscraper for a very expensive lunch, and the guy says, you could have this city. You're an amazing talent. And again, the parallel with the devil tempting Jesus to throw himself off this high tower. So there are lots of little of these Easter eggs kind of buried in the narrative of the actors' lives as against in the play that they're putting on.
The gospel narrative that they're...
The core story. And there's a number of those, we don't have time to go through them all, but I think that's one of the things that makes the film so interesting and so intriguing. It's funny, there's tragedy.
It's so funny, yeah. I don't think I'd realised that it was like a satirical comedy almost. I don't know what my preconception was if I hadn't, but it certainly wasn't that it was going to be as funny as it is.
Yeah. And I think that's why it won things. Like
for sure.
It's a great film, and as we were talking about earlier, it would be great if they'd put out a decent print of it, because
there's a DVD.
The DVD is so rough,
and I'm pretty sure it's a VHS transfer because it looks horrible. It reminds me in not in a narrative sense, but in some of the stuff we've just been talking about, it reminds me of Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ in the way that it isn't claiming at all to be a faithful, factual depiction of the gospel as per the four gospels in Scripture. But through that, and almost because of that, it depicts real truth that is found in the gospel. There are things in The Last Temptation of Christ which wildly differ from the gospel narrative, which if people pay attention at the beginning of the film, it says this is based on a novel, not on the gospels. A bit of a clue. But in doing so, it's not about presenting that as an alternate truth. It's presenting that as a narrative that then draws out things in subtext that you can read into, whether it's the parallel that I noticed immediately was Daniel, the lead actor, going and gathering his crew of actors, mirroring Jesus going out and gathering his crew of disciples.
And rescuing them all from the sort of jobs that actors do.
Yeah.
Doing voiceovers for a pornographic film, being an announcer at a stargazing museum. Interactive thing.
Yeah.
And being abused and belittled as a young female actor doing perfume advertisements. And collecting this ragtag bunch together to put the play on. And again, that's right. It's just him collecting the crew together to do the thing. Yeah.
And I guess the last one that I want to touch on is when he flips and drives out the executives and the casting directors at they're casting an ad for something from memory, and they cajole one of the females in the group to start to disrobe and take clothes off more than she's comfortable with, and he flips the tables and comes to her defense and literally whips with a TV cable. And it's clearly not an accurate depiction of Scripture, but it's an accurate depiction of
righteous anger standing up for
the character
oppressed.
of Jesus. Yeah. So I think it's Yeah, really. Not that I wasn't thinking I'd enjoy it. It was more that I was moved by it in ways that I didn't think that it was going to. Yeah.
And I think, like I wouldn't say go home and watch it tonight, but I reckon in another month you could watch it again and you'd probably spot some more things in it that are little parallels or whatever.
Yeah.
I think there's another little bit where there's a member of the audience who responds personally to the actor playing Jesus in quite a disturbing way because there's this, does this person understand that this isn't Jesus? And it's kind of, I don't know what it's trying to say, but you kind of go, oh, that's really uncomfortable. Is this person deluded? Or is it just this is a powerful portrayal and people are responding to it?
It's very
lots of layers to that, I think.
Yeah. So, before we go to the final thing I want to talk to you about, maybe if people are interested in seeing it, love to hear what people think if they do want to go and find this movie, Jesus of Montreal. I'm not sure if it's streaming anywhere. I couldn't find it. You may have to go hunting on eBay for a disc.
Interesting live event for...
there you go.
Throw that idea in.
Stay tuned. So the Turramurra Passion kind of came to a natural conclusion, wrapped up. Final performances in 2012. Can you maybe take us through? There was an interim, and then maybe a re-emerging of the
not quite a reboot. So I'd had this other idea. So in 2006, the BBC did a production, and back in those days, all those years ago, there wasn't lots of stuff on YouTube. There wasn't streaming. There wasn't BBC streaming websites, or maybe there was and I couldn't get access to it. So I'd heard about this thing, and in the end what I bought so I could see it in fullness was a DVD that someone had recorded it off the TV and burnt. So it was a pirate DVD effectively. So it was a live-to-air broadcast at Easter in Manchester using multiple sites, and the key theme was that it was using Manchester music to tell the story. So there was motion through the city, a crowd of about 7,000 in the central square, and the actors moving towards that, and what they were doing being live broadcast to a big screen at the centre. And so there was some live action at the centre. Pontius Pilate was the storyteller. And then Jesus and the disciples were moving towards the centre with the action of the story happening and them entering the scene where the big square was. And so I think the best scene is Jesus singing Joy Division's Love Will Tear Us Apart as part of the Last Supper. It's astonishing. And Judas singing the Smiths' Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now after it had all gone down. And then the show concludes with Stone Roses' I Am the Resurrection. I think I'd written I'd thought of the 10 Australian songs for the Australian version of it, while I was watching it.
Yeah.
So this idea of, I think my core idea was Passion in the Pub.
Yep.
A rock band, 4 or 5 singers to tell and sing the story, and gritty, loud Australian pub music. That was kind of the structure of the Turramurra Passion script, stripped down, the songs put in it. It was kind of sitting there half done. And we were approached by Wesley Mission as the drama team from Turramurra, who had done the Turramurra Passion play, to do their open-air drama on Good Friday on the streets of Sydney. And so I had been to see that production as part of seeing Passion play stuff at some stage in the previous few years. And that was some kind of gathering and telling of the story at Martin Place, at the amphitheatre there, for those who know Central Sydney. And then a procession of Jesus carrying the cross up Pitt Street through the centre of the city. And I think what they had done was that then led into a church service, that kind of Jesus led the crowd, not that the crowd mostly went. So we pitched and they agreed to do the musical version. And so a new group of actors, a new person playing Jesus, who obviously needed to be someone with musical theatre background because they were singing a lot. So, it had to be a musical cast. We needed a band and we needed to work out how to fit a procession up the middle of Sydney. And also my strong proposal to the Wesley leadership was that the thing should have a finish outside the Wesley Mission building rather than remain unfinished and ask people to come inside, because we knew that people mostly didn't go inside. And so that's what we did. We did that for 5 years. From the second year on, we also did lead-up performances in churches, at our home church at Turramurra, but at other places, because the first performance is always rough. Look, there's no way around it. And so I wanted the peak performance to be in front of the peak audience. So I think we did that from the second year on, and that just made such a huge difference in how good it was when it got to the stage. It got changed every year. It evolved. Cast evolved. The band evolved. When we had two different guys playing the lead. We had the construction of the metro station at Martin Place, cutting off our route for the procession up to Pitt Street. We had, what's going on behind the scenes, of course, totally appropriately, is risk assessments, council agreeing for roads to be closed. And it's interesting, even in that 5-year period, the extent to which there was people around on Good Friday in the afternoon in the city significantly changed. And I think over that 5 years, the crowd kind of grew from a bunch of a couple of hundred people from the Wesley Mission congregations and a few people around, and it ended and has remained, as far as I can tell, more like 1,000 people. So let me tell you, trying to get 1,000 people to do what you want them to do as you walk up Sydney and land at a destination is a little bit harder than getting 100 people to do it. So crowd control, all that kind of stuff. But I think, the Passion in the Pub thing remains to be done.
Interesting idea.
Like now, the biggest problem with that is that the songs that I inserted into that come from the 80s and 90s, and one or two from the 70s, in fact. It was very clear that plenty of the cast didn't know the songs.
Yeah.
And I was very conscious that that meant that possibly for a young audience, someone would have to pick songs that I didn't know, as where, in the classic rock circuits at music festivals where they trot that stuff out, people go, there'd be context where it would be fine, but there would be others where people wouldn't get the absolute beauty of the churches under the Milky Way being sung in the Garden of Gethsemane. If you don't know that song, you won't grab it.
Yeah.
In the same way that if you don't know Love Will Tear Us Apart by Joy Division, you won't grab what's going on in that scene in the Manchester Passion. So that's an interesting thing. That's a project that remains Passion in the Pub remains an unperformed thing. But again, I think you can find a full version of the Manchester Passion on YouTube these days. Look, it's not perfect. I don't know that I'd have picked Robbie Williams' Angels as one of the songs. But bits of it are astonishing, just absolutely astonishing. And that kind of had some influence on the melding in to the rewritten Turramurra play that then became the Wesley play, which was 2013 to 2018.
So 106, you reckon?
Something like that.
Something like that. Probably one of the better qualified people for me to ask this question then is, what do you think is the essentials of a good... maybe it's a two-pronged question. From an audience perspective, like what are the essentials, or maybe just like what are the essences of the Passion narrative that have to be there to grab the audience? And maybe what are there any things that have like continually stuck out to you over the years as particularly edgy or interesting about the narrative?
Yeah, I think it's the classic divine and humanness together. And I think I haven't raised Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ as an influence artistically, because it wasn't one. But the scene in the garden and the anguish of Jesus making the choice to go forward, you have to get that.
Yeah.
I think it's, that's such a thing.
Yeah.
That he's laying down.
According to scripture,
power.
he's sweating blood. According to I think it's
exactly.
Luke. Yeah.
Because that's where the story turns. And I think I've heard a preacher, say, "What if he hadn't gone ahead with it?" Right?
And that's Last Temptation of Christ. Is that similar question? But what if the humanity of Jesus in that turning point overpowered or made the choice instead of the divinity? And that conflict I find fascinating.
Yeah. I think the ordinariness of the crew, Peter, Judas, Andrew, whoever you're portraying, and I think the reality of the hope of resurrection, and I think the story of the disciples and what happened next is testimony to the power of resurrection hope, because you just can't imagine them doing it if it didn't happen.
Yeah.
They got, crucified upside down and beaten, like all this stuff happened because of what they had witnessed. They had seen Jesus had risen from the dead, and that drove the rest of their lives. Some of them for not very long. And you just can't, you've got to have that. And, some of the portrayals in, Superstar, Godspell, they're not willing to go there.
I even think of like Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson one, doesn't even begin to go there because it seems to be more focused on the suffering, and then there's literally one shot that implies he's been resurrected. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, that's the lens through which that particular story is choosing its importance. And you know, I don't want to say I'll leave out the gory bits, but perhaps, you know, we haven't talked about the portrayal of the crucifixion in the Turramurra Passion. Well, the play was held in small spaces, and then as we came to the crucifixion scene, it was in the large auditorium. There's a larger than life-sized cross on the wall, and what we could do in 1999, which we continued to do, was we took a 35mm slide of Jesus in the crucified position, and we wrapped the cross in material for the sole purpose of getting definition of the projected image, and projected this larger-than-life image of Jesus on the cross without blood or gore or anything. And people would walk, you mentioned the tunnel, walk through this small enclosed tunnel into this huge open space, and the only light, apart from the emergency exit signs, which always drove me crazy, was this larger-than-life glowing image of the crucified Christ on the cross. That I think that had impact without
needing the
gore.
Yeah.
And then I think we just turned that projector off, was the way that the Romans took the body down, in inverted commas. So, yeah, I mean, that's something that obviously does need to be portrayed in that story. But for me, I've just always found the turning point in the garden as being doesn't make the things that happened afterwards less important. It makes them possible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Was there anything? I mean, that probably brings us to a good place to park the car.
Yeah.
I guess because you mentioned the pub passion in the pub, which obviously isn't a current project.
Yeah.
If it is a future project. Maybe as a final question, what does Easter look like now for you? Because it's less wrapped up in the weeks of rehearsal and performance.
I know, and it's such.
And we're recording this, I think, in the first week of Lent.
Yes. It was tricky for a while because during the 14 years of doing the Turramurra Passion, the lead up to Easter was really tough going. Working a job, running an amateur theatre, it'd be like running any amateur theatre company that you were involved in a play. And so Easter became, for me, falling in a screaming heap. And not spiritually, just complete exhaustion.
Yeah.
And again, as I said before, we did this before Easter because if we did the play on Easter in a suburban context, people were away. We wouldn't have been able to assemble a cast. And then there was 5 years where the Wesley mission play was on Good Friday, and that had much more of an impact on Easter because I still fell in a screaming heap.
It just was on the weekend.
It was on the actual day. So even 5 or 6 years after that, I find Easter's tricky's not the right word. In some ways, there's still this feeling that something's not happening that it should be because it's been associated for me of doing this thing. Maybe that's prodding that I should be doing something, or maybe it's just habits. So Easter has often been being away. Marking Easter has often been a quiet thing with family rather than going to the church services. We do, at the church that we attend, there's a service on Thursday night, and I find that much more meaningful than the Good Friday service. That's just me. It has that feeling of being the Last Supper thing that it just is so meaningful.
I think that's a not common, but I've definitely spoken to plenty of other people who the Maundy Thursday is like that's the thing.
Yeah.
Which we will be spending a fair whack of time over the next few weeks talking about all of the Lent stuff and Easter adjacent stuff. So if any of this conversation has particularly resonated and you want to follow anything up, you can obviously contact us on social media or email us at filthyhopepod@gmail.com. Can people reach you if they want to follow up anything we've talked about, or are you keeping socials locked down these days?
No, look, well, certainly contact through the Filthy Hope to pass on. And I guess we'll organise some links. I'll just have to think. I think there is a full version of the Turramurra play on YouTube. I think it's cut up. I think it's cut up into acts.
We're gonna have to go and find that.
But I just haven't looked at it for ages.
Yeah.
Jesus of Montreal, definitely see if you can see that.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I'll also rustle up the link for the Manchester Passion. And if we can find the audio for The Man Who Would Be King, I'd be really happy to get hold of that again.
Absolutely.
Because and we also talked about Miracle Maker.
Yes.
Ralph Fiennes.
I looked at the cast
Jesus.
the other day. It's stacked. Everyone's in it. It's crazy. Yeah.
Yep.
And is it stop motion or is it kind of clay?
It's a mixture of stop motion and intertwined with some Russian stylistic animation. So it was a joint Welsh-Russian production.
Gosh, I haven't seen this in so long. When I got my copy of Jesus of Montreal on eBay, I saw that as well and just nabbed it. So it's sitting on my shelf ready to go now.
Yeah, and so if you read about Miracle Maker, you will find multiple comments saying this is the best portrayal of the life of Jesus in film.
Yeah. Wow.
Astonishing work. Yeah.
So as we move towards Easter, the next films that likely we will be talking about, depending on Nessa's availability, as you can clearly tell, she's not here with us today, we'll be looking at some Scorsese, so some Last Temptation of Christ, but also the film Silence. And we will also likely be having a look at the film we mentioned very briefly, The Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson one. If we have time, maybe as a bonus episode, we might also be talking about some Monty Python and Life of Brian. So
I'm available for that discussion.
Yeah, don't worry, you're penciled in. How many times do you reckon you saw it in cinemas again?
More than 10 in the cinema.
Yeah. So if you are after some films to watch, or if you want to do some homework, if you haven't seen those films already over the next few weeks, that's quite likely what we're going to be doing next. That just about does us. Thanks for joining me.
Terrific. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a good week. We will see you next week.
This is a prayer for the people who want to give up, who have been hurt beyond repair and cannot bear to see your face in anything. Find peace in letting go of the guilt that is in yours, and find hope in understanding. Life is not a game you have to win. Forgiveness overwhelming, salvation